Renowned psychologist George Miller once said, "Everyone likes to think that science advances through clear hypotheses. It does indeed progress, but usually thanks to something stumbled upon by chance." In the 1960s, a young and ambitious neurosurgeon named Joseph Bogen set out to find new ways to treat severe epilepsy. He believed that a brain-splitting surgery could help patients for whom medication was ineffective. With the support of Peter Vogel, the head of the neurosurgery department, Bogen initiated the first modern operations on humans. The first patient chosen for this pioneering procedure was Bill Jenkins, a man whose form of epilepsy had proven resistant to all known treatment methods. Undertaking this challenging mission, Joseph Bogen enlisted the support of his colleagues, including Roger Sperry and a young graduate student, Michael Gazzaniga, who helped him develop and conduct a series of studies before and after the surgery. Michael Gazzaniga describes this in his book, Who's in Charge? Free Will and the Science of the Brain. Michael Gazzaniga is a well-known American neuroscientist and one of the founders of cognitive neuroscience. He is a member of the United States National Academy of Sciences and has received numerous awards for his contributions to brain research, particularly in studying the split brain and its influence on consciousness. So it all began with several patients whose corpus callosum was severed as part of epilepsy treatment, effectively destroying the communication channel between the brain's hemispheres. The corpus callosum is a bundle of nerves that usually connects the brain's hemispheres. After such an operation, the hemispheres began to function as separate personalities. Here are the details of the observations. In one of Michael Gazzaniga's experiments with WJ, a patient who underwent corpus callosum separation, researchers sought to understand how the brain's hemispheres function independently. One of the tests was the block design test, used to assess intellectual abilities on the Wechsler scale. Each of the 4 blocks has 6 faces painted in different colors. The patient was shown a card with a specific pattern and asked to recreate it by arranging the blocks in the corresponding order. This task activates certain visual motor functions, and the right hemisphere, which is responsible for spatial perception and coordination, performs better at such tasks. Thus, the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, would quickly and accurately arrange the blocks. When researchers asked the patient to perform the same task with his right hand, which is controlled by the left hemisphere, it turned out that the left hemisphere, responsible for language and analytical abilities, could not handle the task at all. The right hand could not even grasp the basic concept of arranging the blocks to form a 2x2 square and would often place 3 blocks together, leaving the 4th aside. This looked impressive, as it was clear that the right hemisphere had a distinct advantage in this type of task. The situation was complicated by the fact that the left hand would often intervene and correct the right hand's mistakes. As a result, researchers had to ask WJ to sit on his left hand so that the right hand could act independently. In the final part of the experiment, the patient was allowed to use both hands, and an interesting phenomenon emerged. The right hand attempted to arrange the blocks incorrectly, while the left, controlled by the right hemisphere, intervened and corrected the mistakes. It seemed as if 2 separate consciousnesses were competing for control over the task. The hands appeared to be in disagreement with each other, which researchers later called intermanual conflict. Researchers noted that previous neurological studies had already indicated that damage to the right hemisphere affects the ability to draw 3-dimensional objects, like a cube. This observation was confirmed when WJ could draw a cube with his left hand but not with his right. A psychologist named Dr. Edwards, sometimes referred to as Old Daddy Edwards, joined the experiments. He conducted tests using standard Wechsler methods, and the results were impressive. When working only with his right hand, WJ could not replicate the pattern correctly, but he performed flawlessly with his left. When the results of the experiment were shown to Roger Sperry, who had a habit of responding with cautious skepticism, he noted that the patient might have learned to complete the task over time. However, the differences in task performance between the left and right hands were so striking that it couldn't be merely a matter of practice. Later, these experiments showed that while similar discrepancies were not observed in some patients, for WJ, they remained consistent over 2 years. This confirmed the conclusion that splitting the brain affects each hemisphere's ability to autonomously process different types of tasks and information. The question of interaction between sensations and movements is key to understanding the workings of the split brain. Modern research has allowed scientists to identify different mechanisms involved in specific tasks, although this was not obvious at the beginning of these studies. Joe Bogen noted that other patients from the California group did not show such striking differences between hands during the block test as WJ did. This raised an important question. Why did some patients have such different results? Studying these individual features made it possible to better understand how the brain works. At the time, the lab researchers were fascinated by the problem of sensoromotor coordination in cats, monkeys, and humans. It is known that each of the brain's split hemispheres better controls the opposite hand. Colwyn Trevarthen, then a researcher at Caltech, conducted a series of experiments with monkeys that showed that when one hand performed a task, the opposite hemisphere learned it. The hemisphere corresponding to the same side received the same information, but did not learn it. However, if the task-performing hand changed, the other hemisphere quickly began to understand how to perform it. This proved the ability of each hemisphere to effectively control the opposite hand. The main puzzle was how the hemisphere controlled the same side of the body. In WJ's experiments, it was clear that the brain's hemispheres could easily control opposite hands, but had difficulty with the same side hand. This observation led to the idea of two separate consciousnesses capable of acting autonomously. However, over time, more patients showed control over the same side of the body, although this required greater effort in finger movement control. Ultimately, scientists concluded that in most patients, control over the same side developed gradually. Studies of patients on both coasts and animal experiments confirmed this. Successful control of this side prompted a reconsideration of previous assumptions about centralized movement control. It turned out that there is no single command center in the brain that governs movement. Each hemisphere could use signals from the other to form a collective response. The explanation for this mechanism became clearer after researchers conducted split-brain experiments on monkeys. In these studies, one of the animal's eyes was closed, and the hemisphere receiving the visual information controlled only the opposite hand. For instance, when the right eye was closed and the left remained open, the left hemisphere controlled the right hand, which skillfully and quickly grasped grapes. When the animal tried to use its left hand, a different strategy emerged. The left hemisphere oriented the body, and feedback helped the right hemisphere understand the object's location. Eventually, the hand would reach the object and the fingers would grasp it. Studies showed that the lack of right hemisphere specialization in the block tests in some patients was not only understandable, but also expected. Patient WJ had additional brain damage besides the disruption of the corpus callosum, causing the systems responsible for feedback and control over the same side of the body to malfunction. Other patients had fewer neurological impairments and quickly learned to use these systems. When the group studied patients from the East Coast, it was observed that immediately after surgery, control over the same side of the body was weak but gradually improved. This happened as the hemispheres learned to assist each other. The split brain research project took a lot of time, but it was not the only area of study, as there was a possibility it could be discontinued. Although patient WJ was the first to start split brain research, it later became clear that his case was not the most interesting. The functions of his right hemisphere were quite limited, but the initial experiments with him helped answer key questions about the effects of the split. Notably, it was proven that visual signals entering one hemisphere did not transfer to the other. This helped clarify the sensory system scheme and determine the brain's ability to control the hands. Scientists were also interested in the mute right hemisphere's ability to handle cognitive tasks. Does it have any language abilities? Can it solve problems or learn simple games? For over 2 years, these questions remained central. It turned out that WJ's right hemisphere had only basic cognitive abilities. It could handle simple object-matching tasks, but struggled with more complex ones. For example, when shown a picture of a triangle, the patient could choose the correct shape from others. But when it came to words like apple, the right hemisphere failed. A test for basic recognition ability demonstrated that the right hemisphere operates independently, but its abilities are limited and do not include word processing. Only later studies of other patients revealed some linguistic potential in the right hemisphere. With the arrival of new patients like NG and LB, it became clear that split brain research could be even more fruitful. Although patient WJ laid the groundwork for this field, new cases greatly expanded the understanding of brain function. Researchers also studied whether memories remain in different hemispheres of the monkey's brain. It turned out that memories in monkeys were stored only in one hemisphere, while in cats, they were stored in each separately. This showed that WJ's memories associated with words were stored only in the left hemisphere, while the right hemisphere lacked this ability. However, both hemispheres could recognize objects, even if the right hemisphere could not name them. Later studies on monkeys showed that in some individuals, memories could be stored in both the left and right hemispheres. This contradicted the assumption of initial hemisphere specialization. Some patients exhibited language abilities in both hemispheres, but in most cases, only one did. Thus, individual differences between patients became even more apparent, and the question of where memories are stored remained a mystery. Over time, the approach to brain research changed. The first research results, published by Bogen, Sperry, and others, mainly focused on WJ. Individual cases are always interesting but do not provide the full picture needed for general conclusions. Later, when more patients were studied, it became clear that testing WJ, while foundational for split brain studies, could not show all the effects of the surgery. Initially, the picture seemed simple and clear, but it later proved to be only the beginning of a deeper understanding. 50 years have passed, but the full consequences of severing the brain's main highway are still not fully understood. Corpus callosum surgeries are rarely performed, and with the development of new treatment methods and drugs, they are becoming even less common. Bogen always noted that science advances as follows. Great discoveries are made first, and later they accumulate numerous details. The new patients who gradually joined the study only complicated the picture. As previously mentioned, it was found that each hemisphere can control both hands, but not both hands at the same time. Initially, this seemed logical, as it was known that each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. Eventually, it became clear that each hand could indicate the point of touch on either side of the body, suggesting that sensory information from both sides of the body reaches each hemisphere. However, later research disproved this assumption. Some patients developed advanced right hemisphere abilities, which were shown to be capable of performing non-verbal tasks. This demonstrated that the brain has an interactive and dynamic system, even when its parts function independently. One of the key mechanisms was the connection to emotions. Emotions affect a person's cognitive states almost constantly. More primitive areas of the brain, located beneath the corpus callosum, control emotions and have connections to both hemispheres. This raised the question, Can emotions experienced by one hemisphere be perceived by the other? These questions became relevant after comparing patients WJ and NG when it was noticed that each hemisphere tries to monitor the actions of the other. During tests with patient NG, researchers noticed that each hemisphere could give cues to the other through subtle movements, such as head motions. It resembled a dance where each partner interacts with the other through delicate hints, like in tango. Over time, patients became more skilled at this self-cueing. Research showed that even in split hemispheres, there is an exchange of cues, and this phenomenon was termed cross-cuing. It was observed in both animal studies and tests with humans, and was repeated over the next 50 years of research. One of the experiments with patient NG demonstrated this phenomenon. When she saw a colored flash in her right visual field associated with the left hemisphere, she would correctly name the color. But when the flash appeared in the left visual field associated with the right hemisphere, she initially named one color and then corrected her response. It seemed as though the right hemisphere sent a signal to the left, which adjusted the response based on the hint received. This cueing strategy was so intriguing that researchers began designing experiments to better understand its mechanism. An idea emerged that cues might be transmitted through bypass pathways, connecting the hemispheres. Observations showed that one part of the brain could influence the other, even if a direct connection was severed. Overall, these discoveries changed the approach to understanding the brain, demonstrating that mental processes can interact even in a split brain. Research on patients with neurological disorders often reveals common principles of brain function. For example, patients almost always strive to complete the task set by the researcher, but use different strategies to do so. The main challenge is to determine exactly how they achieve the goal. Sometimes the mechanisms discovered are surprisingly ingenious. While reviewing video recordings of experiments, one remarkable scene was identified that illustrates how cueing may occur when a patient tries to replicate a gesture shown by the other hand. This example was demonstrated by DR, a split-brain patient who previously worked as an accountant and was a fan of the series Star Trek. After her surgery, she exhibited all the standard signs of hemisphere separation. Visual and tactile signals were not transmitted between them. The left hemisphere handled speech, while the right handled image recognition. During the study, she was asked to show a hitchhiker gesture with her right hand, which she did immediately, and then with her left hand, also without issue. When asked to show an OK gesture with her right hand, she did so instantly, but with her left, there was a delay. This experiment demonstrated the importance of knowing how a patient performs tasks during testing. The left hemisphere, which understood verbal commands, transmitted them to the right hemisphere, which controlled the movement of the left hand. The question arose, how can signals given to one hemisphere affect the other part of the brain? Patient WJ had significant difficulty controlling the same side of the body, whereas other patients, like DR, showed varying levels of control. Problems controlling the left hand could have been related to the fact that the hemispheres had lost connection, and the left hemisphere couldn't transmit precise commands to the right. To understand this phenomenon, researchers changed the task. The patient was asked to perform a gesture first with her left hand, but without prior demonstration by the right. She could not do it correctly. However, when asked to show the gesture with her right hand, she succeeded without difficulty. Changing the order of tasks showed that the right hemisphere needed a visual cue from the left. For further study, the patient's eyes were closed, and she was again asked to perform the gesture. She performed the task with her right hand, but failed with her left, as the right hemisphere couldn't see the sample and did not understand the verbal command. This test demonstrated the limitations of connections between the hemispheres after surgery and showed how disconnection affects purposeful actions. The main conclusion was that the brain, even when its parts are disconnected, can create alternative mechanisms to achieve a set goal. Patients used all available resources to solve tasks, demonstrating a universal principle of self-cueing that underlies goal-directed behavior. During experiments on basic sensory-motor control at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and later at Dartmouth, scientists became increasingly interested in the capabilities of the isolated right mute hemisphere. Researchers wanted to understand what it was capable of in terms of thinking, perception, comprehension, and planning. With patient WJ, this was difficult, as the right hemisphere showed only slight reactions to information presented to it alone. The left hemisphere responded to tasks as easily as in healthy individuals, but the right hemisphere's responses remained minimal. With the arrival of patient NG, a young woman with a supportive husband, it became possible to deepen the research. She, like WJ, was operated on due to severe epilepsy, and she agreed to testing, which allowed researchers to enrich their understanding of the effects of brain division. The research findings with NG revealed new nuances, including the fact that the right hemisphere could process information and perform complex tasks without the left's participation. Another important patient was 12-year-old LB, also operated on to control epileptic seizures. He became extremely valuable to researchers, as he provided new data on the functioning of the right hemisphere. Unlike WJ, LB's right hemisphere responded actively to stimulation, even if the left hemisphere was isolated from this information. During experiments with NG and LB, researchers began actively using video recordings to document the process. It was observed that objects held in the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, were easily named by the patients. However, objects in the left hand couldn't be named. Particularly striking was that images and even words shown to the right hemisphere prompted the left hand to reach for the correct object. This became the first evidence that the right hemisphere could perform complex cognitive actions unknown to the left. Later, researchers concluded that the right hemisphere has a significant vocabulary and can respond to written words and simple images. Sometimes it could even spell out words or write them, though this was rare. It was found that the right hemisphere has basic language abilities, although they remain limited. To verify these conclusions, scientists continued experiments to find out whether the right hemisphere could respond to emotional stimuli. After experiments on monkeys, where strong emotional stimuli altered behavior, it was decided to test how this works in humans. A series of images, including neutral and provocative ones, were collected for this purpose. In one of these studies, patient NG was shown an image that made her right hemisphere react to an emotional stimulus. When shown a picture of a nude woman, she tried to hide a smile and said that the recording device looks funny. This indicated that the right hemisphere recognized the emotional context. To confirm the results, they decided to repeat the experiments with WJ, but his reaction was entirely different. When asked about the image, he responded calmly and seriously, even joking about female students at Caltech. This emphasized the importance of avoiding generalizations in research. Each patient is unique, and each reaction may differ. These discoveries allowed scientists to gain a deeper understanding of how isolated parts of the brain function and highlighted the complexity of mental processes that even a single hemisphere is capable of performing. This is just a small part of the book, which reveals the remarkable discoveries in neuroscience made by Michael Gazzaniga. If these stories intrigued you, purchase the book. A link is available below the video. By the way, this time, Martin the cat blissfully slept through the entire video, so there were no cynical remarks from him. The topic simply didn't interest him, as Martin is firmly convinced that humans don't have a brain. But don't worry, he'll be back with new comments in the next episodes. Like, share, and feed Martin the cat, because I refuse to keep such a rascal on my own.